Summary for Unit 6, The Cold War. Unit 6 has explored the Cold War, a concept that describes the multifaceted and dynamic struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union for global dominance from 1949 to 1989. Although the Cold War had many contradictory dimensions, one essential feature of this conflict was the prevalent assumption that this conflict represented a clash of civilizations. Soviet communism and liberal democracy represented irreconcilable systems that could not peacefully coexist. The other main feature of the Cold War was the threat and the fear of nuclear annihilation. This grim reality forced competition from the battlefield to the arena of culture, espionage, and sport. The Korean War represented the first battlefield of the Cold War, and in that respect it established the informal rules for limited warfare that would define subsequent superpower engagements. Although never enshrined in any official agreement, both superpowers mutually recognized the idea of limited war. In other words, nuclear weapons could not be contemplated, and both sides needed to exercise restraint when jostling for position in the Third World. The net result was proxy wars, where both sides used economic aid, technical assistance, and military arms to cultivate allies in the post-colonial world, and in order to finance guerrillas to subvert enemy regimes in order to expand their global influence. For 13 days in October 1962, the world held its collective breath as human civilization brushed close to the brink of nuclear war. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev acted rashly in the lead-up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, yet both showed leadership in calmly resisting pressure for escalation and stepping back from a potential apocalypse. In the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis represented a turning point, resulting in informal acceptance of peaceful coexistence, setting the stage for détente, and creating new safeguards to limit the risk of nuclear war. Although the United States and Soviet Union remained enemies and fought bitterly in the Third World, subsequently, both sides viewed their enemy as rooted in a realpolitik rather than myths and caricatures. The Soviets and Americans came to see each other as rivals, with tangible interests that could be understood and that could be addressed through rational policies rather than boogeymen bent upon destruction of their way of life. While the Cuban Missile Crisis diminished the risk of nuclear war, it ironically gave the superpowers free rein to pursue their interests inside the Third World. For this reason, the post-1960s epoch was arguably the most destructive period for people living in the Third World, as both sides exploited decolonization to seek new clients and to trumpet their way of life. Although the Cold War spanned the entire globe, its impacts were diversely felt, given cultural differences and divergent colonial histories in the various world regions, as well as their variant strategic importance. Asia became the Cold War's main battleground, primarily because China sought to expand its influence in this region. Africa, despite its minor strategic significance, was devastated because its states were often weak, ethnically diverse, and vulnerable to outside influences. Latin America remained largely inside the U.S. sphere of influence, but right-wing regimes diverted the Cold War to justify the repression of their own peoples. The Arab world emerged as a battlefront where both superpowers tried to co-opt nationalist movements over toward their side. But ultimately, neither side was able to win over a region that embraced its past and rejected elements of scientific modernity. Finally, the Cold War was driven by irrational fears rather than an objective security assessment. Rivalry with a monolithic other, demonization of the enemy's motives, and exaggeration of their threat created a permanent state of fear that united people around an extreme form of nationalism that justified the rise of a military-industrial complex at the expense of social programs, while also turning a blind eye to the mass suffering provoked by global interventionism that pursued morally questionable policies in the name of defending fundamental freedoms.